There's a valley in rural Appalachia where the children stopped crying. Not because they were content, not because they were loved, but because their vocal cords had been twisted by something far darker than neglect. For over 200 years, one family bred only within itself, father to daughter, brother to sister, cousin to cousin, until the bloodline became so tangled that nature itself began to rebel. The children born into this silence couldn't scream when they were hungry, couldn't weep when they were hurt. They could only stare with pale, unblinking eyes that seemed to know they should never have existed at all. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is what happens when isolation becomes a prison and a family becomes its own graveyard. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Whitaker family settled in the mountains of West Virginia in 1768, back when the frontier was still a savage, lawless place where families could disappear into the hollows and never be seen again. They came from England, fleeing debts and whispers of shame that followed them across the Atlantic like a curse they couldn't outrun. The first generation built a homestead in a valley so remote that even the nearest town was a 2-day ride through treacherous terrain. They told themselves they were seeking freedom. What they found was something far more sinister, a kind of freedom that allowed them to become their own isolated universe, accountable to no one, visible to no one, until the laws of man and nature ceased to apply. The patriarch, Thomas Whitaker, was a stern man with a face like carved stone and eyes that never seemed to settle on anything for long. He brought with him 3 sons and 2 daughters. And when his wife died during the crossing, he told the children that they were all they had now, that the outside world was dangerous, that strangers carried disease and treachery, that trust could only exist within the bloodline. It was a philosophy that would echo through the generations like a curse spoken into a canyon, bouncing back louder and more distorted each time it returned. By 1790, the oldest son had married his sister. Not in a church, and not with any formal ceremony, but in the quiet, unspoken way that things happened when there were no witnesses and no one to say it was wrong. The younger children grew up believing this was natural. They had never seen another family. They had never attended a school or a social gathering. The only faces they knew were the faces they saw every morning across the breakfast table, faces that grew more familiar, more similar, more disturbingly alike with each passing year. By the time the 1800s arrived, the Whitaker family had become something else entirely. 3 generations deep into isolation, and the genetic consequences were already beginning to show themselves in ways that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Children were born with fingers that bent at wrong angles, with eyes that didn't quite track together, with jaws that hung slightly open, as if perpetually surprised by their own existence. The family elders spoke of these abnormalities as tests from God, as trials to be endured with silent dignity. But in truth, they knew, somewhere in the primitive understanding that exists beneath language and rationalization, they understood that they were doing something that nature herself was trying to prevent. The valley became a closed circuit of genetic material. The same DNA folding back onto itself again and again, like a piece of paper creased so many times that it begins to tear along the lines. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives when their own wives died in childbirth, which happened with disturbing frequency in that isolated place where medical knowledge was scarce and superstition filled the gaps. The family tree didn't branch outward the way trees are meant to. It grew inward, roots tangling with roots, strangling itself from within. And with each generation, the silence in the valley grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how far this experiment in human isolation could go before it collapsed entirely. By 1840, something new appeared. A child was born who couldn't cry. The mother held the infant in her arms, watching its face turn red with the effort of screaming, but no sound emerged. Just a desperate, wheezing silence that made the other children in the room step backward, frightened by something they couldn't name. The midwife, herself a cousin twice removed, made the sign of the cross, and whispered that it was a punishment. But punishment for what? For loving family too much? For staying loyal to the bloodline? The questions hung in the air like smoke, but no one dared speak them aloud. The silent child survived, which surprised everyone. Most infants born with severe abnormalities in that era died within days, their small bodies unable to fight off the infections and complications that came with genetic disorders. But this child lived, and as she grew, it became clear that her silence wasn't a temporary condition. She would never speak, never laugh, never cry out in pain when she fell or burned herself on the cooking fire. She moved through the world like a ghost, and the family learned to read her needs in the desperate gestures of her hands and the haunted expression that never left her pale, too wide eyes. The silent children became more common as the decades wore on. By 1870, nearly 1 in every 3 births produced a child who couldn't vocalize properly. Some were completely mute. Others could only produce guttural, animal-like sounds that barely resembled human speech. The family began to see this as normal, the way people adapt to any horror if they're exposed to it long enough. They developed a crude sign language, a series of gestures and facial expressions that allowed the silent ones to communicate basic needs. But there was something profoundly disturbing about watching a child try to scream in terror and produce nothing but a hollow wheeze, watching their small chest heave with the effort of making a sound that would never come. The outside world had largely forgotten about the Whitakers. Occasionally, a traveling preacher or a lost hunter would stumble into their valley and leave with stories that sounded too bizarre to be believed. They spoke of a family where everyone looked eerily similar, where pale-eyed children watched from windows with expressions too knowing for their years, where the adults moved with a shuffling, uncertain gait that suggested bodies not quite built correctly. But these stories were dismissed as mountain folklore, the kind of exaggerated tales that people told around fires to frighten each other. No one investigated. No one intervened. The Whitakers remained hidden in their valley like a secret too shameful to acknowledge. By the turn of the 20th century, the genetic damage had accelerated beyond anything the family could have imagined. Children were born with skulls that were too soft, that remained pliable well into childhood, denting slightly when pressed. Some had teeth that grew in twisted spirals, overlapping each other in mouths too small to contain them. Others had limbs of unequal length, forcing them to walk with a lurching, crab-like motion that made them objects of pity and revulsion even within their own family. And still the marriages continued within the bloodline, because what choice did they have? The outside world was foreign and frightening. The valley was all they knew. The medical community, such as it existed in rural Appalachia at the time, had no framework for understanding what was happening to the Whitaker family. Genetics as a formal science was still in its infancy. Mendel's work with pea plants was only just beginning to be understood and applied to human heredity. The doctors who occasionally encountered Whitaker family members on rare trips to distant towns simply noted their abnormalities and moved on, attributing the conditions to bad luck or divine displeasure. No one connected the physical deformities to the family's breeding practices. Or if they did, they kept their suspicions to themselves, understanding that some truths were too uncomfortable to speak aloud in polite society. The 1920s brought the first real documentation of what was happening in that forgotten valley. A young social worker named Margaret Harris, fresh from her training in Charleston, was assigned to conduct a rural census in the most remote parts of West Virginia. Her supervisor warned her about the Whitaker family before she made the journey, told her not to be alarmed by what she might see, but nothing could have prepared her for what she encountered when she finally reached their homestead on a gray October morning in 1923. She found 14 people living in conditions that barely qualified as human habitation. The house was more of a collection of rotting boards, held together by habit and desperation, than an actual structure. But it wasn't the poverty that struck her. Poverty was common in those mountains, expected even. It was the people themselves. Margaret's official report, which still exists in the West Virginia State Archives, describes children with facial features so similar they appeared to be variations of the same face, printed slightly differently each time. She wrote about adults who couldn't answer simple questions about their ages or relationships to one another, who seemed confused by the concept of a family tree that extended beyond the valley. And she wrote about the silence, the unnatural, oppressive silence that hung over the property like a physical presence. 3 of the children she encountered that day couldn't speak at all. 2 others could only produce sounds she described as primitive vocalizations, more animal than human in quality. The oldest woman in the family, who claimed to be 60 but looked 80, explained through broken sentences and hand gestures that this was normal, that it had always been this way, that the Lord had made them special. Margaret asked about the children's fathers. The old woman smiled, revealing a mouth with only 4 remaining teeth, and said simply, "We keep it in the family, safer that way." The casual nature of this admission, the complete absence of shame or awareness that anything was wrong, haunted Margaret for the rest of her life. She filed her report with recommendations for immediate intervention, medical examinations, educational programs, possible relocation of the children to environments where they could receive proper care. Her supervisor read the report, placed it in a filing cabinet, and told her to focus on families that could actually be helped. The implication was clear. The Whitakers were too far gone, too damaged, too expensive to save. It was easier to leave them in their valley, to let them continue their slow genetic collapse away from public view, where their existence wouldn't force uncomfortable questions about how such a situation could persist for over 150 years without anyone doing anything to stop it. The Great Depression should have destroyed the Whitaker family. It destroyed nearly everyone else in those mountains, drove farmers from their land, shuttered mines, turned entire towns into ghost settlements where starving families waited for help that never came. But the Whitakers survived, partly because they had so little to lose in the first place, and partly because their isolation had made them experts in a kind of subsistence living that bordered on prehistoric. They hunted with traps made from salvaged wire. They grew stunted vegetables in soil so depleted it could barely support weeds. They survived, but survival came at an even steeper cost than before. During the 1930s, the family reached what modern geneticists would call a critical threshold, a point where the gene pool had become so restricted that harmful recessive traits appeared in nearly every birth. Children emerged from the womb with conditions that had no names, syndromes so rare and specific to inbreeding that medical textbooks wouldn't document them for another 50 years. One infant was born with eyes that couldn't close properly, the lids malformed and insufficient, forcing the family to keep the child in darkness to prevent the eyeballs from drying out. Another came into the world with organs positioned incorrectly inside the body cavity, the heart tilted at an angle that made every breath a struggle. These children rarely lived past their first year, and the family buried them in unmarked graves on the hillside behind the house, tiny mounds that multiplied like mushrooms after rain. The vocalization problem, the inability to cry or speak, had become almost universal by this point. Of the 7 children born between 1930 and 1940, only 1 could produce anything resembling normal speech. And even that child's voice was wrong somehow, pitched too high and too thin, like air escaping from a balloon. The others communicated through an elaborate system of grunts, gestures, and facial expressions that the family understood, but outsiders found deeply unsettling. It was a language born from necessity, from bodies that no longer worked the way human bodies were meant to work. And it marked the Whitakers as something fundamentally other, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human society. A traveling photographer named James Rarin encountered the family in 1938 while documenting poverty in Appalachia. He took 3 photographs before the family patriarch, by then, a man in his 50s with the physical deterioration of someone twice that age, chased him off the property with a rusted shotgun. The rejection should have been a relief. Instead, it became another layer of shame, another confirmation that the family existed outside the boundaries of acceptable American society. While other families sent their sons off to fight and took pride in their service, the Whitakers remained in their valley, untouched by the great patriotic surge that swept the nation, marked as too defective, even for a war that was consuming millions of young lives. The family retreated further into itself, if such a thing was even possible at that point. They stopped making the occasional trips to the distant town for supplies. They stopped allowing outsiders onto their property. They became a rumor, a whispered story that locals told newcomers with a mixture of disgust and dark fascination. By 1950, the family had been practicing concentrated inbreeding for nearly 2 centuries, and the results were exactly what modern genetics would predict. The silent children, those who survived infancy at all, were now being born with cognitive impairments so severe that they could barely function. Some couldn't be toilet trained. Others couldn't feed themselves, even as teenagers, requiring constant supervision and assistance for the most basic human activities. A few displayed behaviors that suggested profound neurological damage, rocking endlessly back and forth, striking their own heads against walls until their foreheads were permanently bruised and scarred, making sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the evolutionary past, before language existed, before humans had learned to shape air into meaning. The state of West Virginia knew about the Whitakers by this point. Social workers had filed reports. County health officials had made notes. Teachers at the nearest school, located some 20 miles away, were aware that there was a family in the mountains whose children never attended classes, who existed in complete isolation from the educational system and from society at large. But knowledge didn't translate into action. This was an era when states' rights meant that families could operate as private kingdoms, when poverty and ignorance were so widespread in rural areas that the Whitakers simply became one more unsolvable problem on a list of thousands. And there was something else, too, a deep cultural reluctance to interfere with family matters. A belief that what happened within the boundaries of private property was nobody's business but the family's own, even when what was happening constituted a slow-motion genetic catastrophe that was producing human beings who barely qualified as functional. The Whitaker family exists today, not as a historical curiosity, not as a closed chapter in some forgotten archive, but as living, breathing people, still occupying that same valley in West Virginia where their ancestors first settled over 250 years ago. In the 21st century, with all our genetic knowledge and social services and mandatory education laws, the Whitakers remain a testament to how thoroughly a family can fall through every crack in the system, how completely society can choose to look away from something too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Modern documentarians have visited the family in recent years, producing videos that circulate online with millions of views and thousands of comments expressing shock, horror, pity, and morbid fascination. The current generation of Whitakers includes adults who cannot speak coherent sentences, who communicate through grunts and gestures that their caregivers have learned to interpret. Some can barely walk. Others have cognitive abilities that testing suggests are equivalent to young children, trapped in adult bodies that have been ravaged by generations of genetic collapse. They live in poverty that would have been familiar to their ancestors in the 1700s. No running water, no electricity in parts of the property, surviving on government assistance and the occasional charity of neighbors who leave supplies at the edge of the property line, unwilling to venture closer. The youngest members of the family, and yes, there are still children being born, continue to display the same horrifying patterns. Some emerge from the womb silent, their vocal cords malformed or absent, their cries locked inside bodies that were never built correctly in the first place. Others show the physical markers of severe inbreeding, skulls that are too small, eyes that don't track properly, limbs that don't develop symmetrically. Medical professionals who have examined family members describe conditions they've never encountered in textbooks. Genetic combinations so rare and so specific to this particular bloodline that they represent unique medical phenomena. The Whitakers have become, in the most tragic sense possible, a living laboratory of what happens when human breeding practices violate every principle of genetic diversity. There are those who argue the family should be forcibly separated, the children removed and placed in care facilities where they might receive proper medical attention and education. Others contend that the Whitakers have the right to live as they choose, that interfering with their lifestyle, no matter how damaging, represents an overreach of government authority. The debate continues in academic circles and social work conferences. But in the valley itself, nothing changes. The family persists in its isolation, cut off from the world, not just by geography now, but by centuries of genetic damage that have left them fundamentally incompatible with modern society. What haunts anyone who studies the Whitaker case isn't just the physical deterioration, the silent children, and the cognitive impairments, and the bodies that barely function. It's the question that hangs over the entire 250-year saga like a ghost that won't be exorcised: how did this happen? How did a family breed itself into genetic oblivion for over 2 centuries while the rest of the world simply watched, documented, filed reports, and did nothing? The answer is uncomfortable and deeply American. It happened because intervention was always too expensive, too complicated, too politically sensitive. It happened because poverty and isolation create invisible people, and invisible people can suffer in ways that would be unthinkable if they occurred in plain sight. It happened because sometimes society decides that certain problems are simply too broken to fix. And the easiest solution is to let them continue in the shadows, out of sight and out of mind, until they become cautionary tales that people watch on YouTube late at night, shaking their heads at the horror of it all before clicking to the next video and forgetting completely. The Whitaker family is still there in that valley. Right now, as you watch this, still isolated, still breeding within the bloodline, still producing children who cannot cry, cannot speak, cannot participate in the world the way human beings are meant to participate. And the rest of us remain what we've always been, witnesses who document the tragedy, express appropriate shock, and then move on with our lives, content to let the horror continue as long as it stays confined to places we'll never visit, affecting people we'll never meet. That's the real story here. Not just what happened to one family in the mountains, but what it says about all of us, that we let it happen. That we're still letting it happen. And that tomorrow, nothing will change except the number of views on videos like this.